July 4th, 1776. Uh, it is a date that carries so much weight, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It is practically a brand at this point.
Right. You hear it and your brain immediately loads the default file. You are picturing Philadelphia,
Yep, the humid room.
a humid room, the smell of old parchment, maybe Thomas Jefferson scratching away with a quill, the Liberty Bell cracking.
The whole origin story.
Exactly. It is the origin story of a nation on the Atlantic seaboard. We know the costumes, we know the script, well, we know the ending.
It is the foundational myth, certainly.
Hmm.
But it is also a bit of tunnel vision.
How so?
Because while the ink was drying in Philadelphia, there was an entirely different 1776 playing out. I mean, on the complete opposite side of the continent.
Right.
It is a narrative that had zero to do with King George or, taxation without representation.
A totally different world.
And everything to do with the desperate survival of a global empire that was, well, it was starting to crack at the edges.
And that is exactly what we are here to talk about today. Welcome to our deep dive into the other 1776.
The other 1776.
Yeah, we're going to look at the sources and the journals of a completely different mission. Because while the Founding Fathers were busy revolutionizing the East, the Spanish Empire was trying to pull off this geopolitical Hail Mary pass in the West.
Very desperate Hail Mary pass.
They were trying to glue together the vast, terrifyingly empty interior of the continent before someone else took it. And the mission for this deep dive is to unpack this journey, relying on the original journals and historical analyses, to understand a mission that, on paper, was a catastrophic failure.
Oh, an absolute disaster on paper.
Right. But we want to look at how it defined the American West. And the way they tried to do this, to secure this territory, wasn't with an army.
No, they didn't have the manpower or the money, frankly, for a massive military campaign. So instead, they sent a team that sounds like the setup for a bad joke.
2 friars and a mapmaker walk into a desert.
Exactly. 2 Franciscan friars, a retired military engineer with a massive ego and a handful of locals, trying to find a road that literally did not exist. We are talking about the Dominguez-Escalante Expedition.
I love this topic so much because it completely flips the map for you. We are so conditioned to look east to west, Manifest Destiny, Lewis and Clark, the Oregon Trail.
Always moving toward the sunset.
Right. But today, we are looking south to north. We are looking at a team that got lost. They almost starved to death. They didn't get where they were going. And yet historians argue it was one of the most successful failures in exploration history.
It really is the ultimate example of unintended consequences. I mean, they went looking for a trade route to the ocean and ended up finding the cultural and geological soul of the Great Basin.
Which is incredible.
But to really understand why these men were willing to walk into a complete blank spot on the map, we have to zoom out first.
We need the context.
Right. We need to look at the geopolitical chessboard. Because in 1776, Spain wasn't just sitting around enjoying a siesta. They were panicking.
Let's parse that panic for a second, because if you are looking at a map of 1776, Spain looks incredibly dominant.
They look huge.
Yeah, they own Mexico, they have the Caribbean, they're in the Philippines, South America, they have the strong foothold in New Mexico with Santa Fe, which, by the way, was already a very old city by then.
Very old. Over a century and a half.
Right, and they have these missions starting up on the California coast. So to a casual observer, it looks like they have a total monopoly on the southern half of North America. So why on earth are they nervous?
Well, they had the real estate, technically speaking, but they didn't have the control. This is the era of the Bourbon reforms. The Spanish crown, specifically King Charles III, he realized that the old way of doing things, just sitting back, building a few isolated missions and hoping for the best, it just wasn't working anymore.
It's too passive.
Way too passive. The empire was bloated, it was inefficient, and crucially, the neighbors were getting way too close.
It is a classic case of use it or lose it. When you say neighbors, who are we talking about here? Because out in the American West in 1776, who is threatening a superpower like Spain?
It was a pincer movement, really. First, you have the Russians.
The Russians in 1776. That always surprises people.
Absolutely, the Russians. They were coming down from the Pacific Northwest, moving along the Alaskan coast, and they were hunting sea otters for fur.
Right, the fur trade.
And you have to understand, Spain viewed the Pacific Ocean as a Spanish lake. That was their term. They felt they owned the entire ocean.
Just claimed the whole thing.
Yeah. So the idea of Russian fur traders setting up shop in what is now Northern California, that was a nightmare scenario for Madrid. They were terrified of this Russian encroachment.
Okay, so you have the Russian bear coming down from the top left of the map.
And then from the top right, coming from the Great Lakes region and Canada, you have the British. The British fur trappers and the Hudson's Bay Company were pushing west. They were constantly probing for river routes to the Pacific. And Spain knew that if the British connected their eastern territory to the Western Ocean, they would effectively cut off Mexico from the north.
Just slice the continent in half.
Exactly. So Spain is being squeezed from both sides.
And right in the middle of this massive continental squeeze, you have their two main outposts. You have Santa Fe, which is this old administrative heart of the northern frontier, but it is totally landlocked in the high desert.
Right.
And then you have Monterey in Alta California, which is this brand new, very fragile colony sitting right on the coast.
Yes.
But they are totally disconnected. They might as well be on different planets for all the good they can do each other.
That is exactly the problem. If you wanted to get supplies or military orders from Mexico City up to Monterey to bolster that defense against the Russians, you had to send them by sea.
And that wasn't easy.
It was awful. 18th century sea travel of the Pacific coast was incredibly expensive and just notoriously unreliable.
Because of the currents.
The currents are rough. The winds are contrary. You were basically sailing against the flow the entire way up the coast of Baja and Alta California. Ships sank constantly. Supplies rotted. Crews got scurvy. It just wasn't a sustainable supply line for military defense.
So they needed a land route, but didn't they already have a way across the south, like through Arizona?
They did, technically, the route through the Sonoran Desert. But think about that terrain for a second.
Brutal.
It is brutally hot. Water is incredibly scarce. But honestly, the biggest problem wasn't the heat or the thirst. It was the Apache.
Ah.
The Apache resistance in that southern corridor was fierce. It was effectively an active war zone. You could not send commercial caravans or supply trains through there without a massive military escort.
Which Spain couldn't afford.
Exactly. They didn't have the troops. It was just a gauntlet of death.
So the big idea here, the strategic Hail Mary we talked about, was to go north, to find a backdoor.
That is it. The theory was, and it was just a theory, go north from Santa Fe into the cooler latitudes. Loop over the difficult canyon terrain, avoid the Apache entirely, and find a cool, well-watered, safe superhighway that just drops you right into Monterey.
A 1776 interstate highway.
Exactly. Connecting the two biggest hubs of the Spanish frontier.
That is a wildly bold plan, considering they had absolutely no idea what was actually out there. I mean, they were literally connecting dots on a blank page with zero empirical data. They were just assuming the geography of the American West would cooperate with their political needs.
Which geography rarely does. They were operating on vague rumors, indigenous hearsay that they often mistranslated, and a whole lot of wishful thinking.
Yeah.
And to execute this wild plan, they assembled a team that is just fascinating because of its internal contradictions. History usually shorthands this as the Escalante Expedition, which is actually a pretty big branding injustice based on the source documents.
Right, because Escalante wasn't technically the boss of this outfit.
Not even close. The man actually in charge, the one whose name was on all the official paperwork and who held the purse strings, was Fray Francisco Atanasio Dominguez.
So why does Dominguez always get second billing in the history books? Why do we always say Dominguez and Escalante, or just default to the Escalante Expedition?
It really comes down to their specific roles on the journey.
Yeah.
Dominguez was a canonical visitor from Mexico City.
What does that mean, exactly?
Think of him as the corporate auditor sent from headquarters to straighten out the messy, rebellious branch office.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, he was sent to inspect the local missions, check the financial books, enforce moral discipline among the priests. He was the official architect of the expedition, the guy with the actual authority. But he was an administrator. He was the suit.
The suit of the 18th century, whereas Escalante...
Fray Silvestre Vélez de Escalante was the intellectual core of the group. He was a Spaniard, yes, but he had been living out in the Zuni paper.
But he had local experience.
Very much so. He had been recruited specifically because he understood the northern tribes. He was younger, he was far more curious about the natural world, and most importantly, he was the writer. He was the one who kept the daily journal.
Ah, there it is. The classic rule of history. If you want to be remembered, you better be the one holding the pen.
It is a universal life lesson. Always take the minutes at the meeting. Because Escalante wrote the daily entries, the voice we hear in the historical record, the descriptions of the landscapes, the encounters that is his voice. We see the world entirely through his eyes, so we naturally associate the whole journey with him. But Dominguez was the one making the hard executive calls.
That makes sense. But we really can't ignore the third wheel in this leadership tricycle, Bernardo Miera y Pacheco. And he wasn't a friar at all.
No, he wasn't. And that friction between him and the friars is key to understanding the whole story of the expedition. Miera was a retired military engineer and a cartographer, an artist.
He drew the map?
He did. And he was in his late 50s at the time, which was considered quite old for this kind of grueling physical work in the 18th century. But he was the hawk of the group.
The hawk.
Yeah, the friars were out there looking for souls to save and geography to map. Muir was there for empire.
Oh.
He was there for glory. He wanted to find lost cities, gold mines, and strategic conquests. He really saw himself as a grand conquistador in an era when conquistadors were rapidly going out of style.
So you have a corporate auditor, a curious writer, and a glory-seeking aging soldier.
Quite the trio.
Plus a crew of locals.
Right. There were about 10 men total in the initial party. And the crew is important to mention because it reflects the real messy demographic reality of New Spain at the time.
Who were they?
Well, you had Andres Muniz, for example. He was the interpreter because he actually spoke Ute.
How did he know Ute?
He had likely been an illegal trader in the past, slipping up into Ute territory against strict Spanish law to trade for hides or captives. So he knew the people and the language.
Very useful guy to have.
Very. And you also had Janissaros on the crew.
Janissaros, for our listeners, what exactly is that?
Janissaros were detribalized indigenous people. Often they had been taken captive as children by rival tribes, ransomed by the Spanish, and raised in Spanish settlements as servants or laborers.
So they were caught between worlds.
Exactly. They lost their original tribal identity, but weren't fully integrated as elite Spaniards either. So this expedition was not some pristine, uniform European military unit. It was a scrappy, mixed-race, highly pragmatic frontier squad.
10 guys walking into a continent-sized mystery. And the target date for their departure is just too perfect. July 4th, 1776.
It is a wild coincidence, isn't it? If they had left on their actual schedule, they would have saddled up their horses and ridden out on the exact same day the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia.
That would have been too neat for history.
Right. But the frontier always has a way of ruining schedules. They didn't actually leave until July 29th.
What held them up for almost a month?
Two things. And both are very indicative of what life was like in 1776 New Mexico. First, there was violence. A Comanche raiding party hit just about 15 miles south of Santa Fe.
That is close.
Very close. And they killed 10 people. The entire colonial government went into immediate lockdown. Escalante actually had to serve as a military chaplain for the armed response team that went out after the raiders.
Wow.
It was a very stark reminder that they weren't leaving from some safe, peaceful haven. They were leaving a fortress that was actively under siege.
Right, the frontier was bleeding. And the second reason for the delay?
Kidney stones.
You are kidding.
Not at all. Escalante suffered from a severe, absolutely agonizing kidney ailment. He was entirely bedridden in towels for days right before the launch.
That is brutal.
It is such a humanizing detail, though. We tend to think of these historic explorers as these invincible Iron Men, but here is Escalante, arguably one of the most important figures in Western history, curled up in a ball in a bed, crying in pain before he even takes the first step of the journey.
It is really interesting to think about the butterfly effect of that specific delay, though. The violence and the kidney stones, because if they leave on July 4th as planned, they hit the mountain passes earlier. Do they run out of water sooner in the deserts?
I genuinely think the delay saved their lives. By leaving on July 29th, they inadvertently timed their arrival in the high mountain country and the harsh deserts in a way that was marginally more survivable.
Oh, so?
Well, if they had hit the Great Basin in the absolute blazing peak of summer heat in July, or if they had tried to cross the mountain rivers a month earlier when they were still swollen with full spring snowmelt, the outcome could have been disastrous. Sometimes, missing your deadline is the only thing that keeps you alive.
That is a great point. So it is July 29th, 1776. They finally ride out of Santa Fe. But they don't just disappear into the total wilderness immediately. They head north first, to the edge of the known world.
Right, they head up to Santa Rosa de Abiquiu.
Abiquiu. Today, that is famous mostly because Georgia O'Keeffe painted there. It is this beautiful, artistic, serene place.
Beautiful today, yes. But in 1776, it was the absolute end of the line. It was a rough and tumble, dangerous outpost. It was filled with what the Spanish called brujos, or witches, and There was a heavy illicit trade in human captives happening there.
A real wretched hive of scum and villainy kind of place.
Exactly. It was where the civilized, administered world ended and the wild, unmapped frontier officially began.
And when they leave Abiquiu, they aren't just carrying backpacks like modern hikers. They are driving an entire herd of cattle.
Right, they took cattle on the hoof. They are literally walking their dinner across the continent.
Which has to slow you down.
It slows you down tremendously, but more importantly, it dictates your entire route. You can't just scramble a sheer cliff or cross a deep, narrow gorge. You have to find a path that a cow can safely walk. It changes the logistics of exploration completely.
Right, the landscape has to accommodate the livestock. So as they move north and west, crossing into what is now western Colorado, they start seeing things that no European had ever recorded. And this is where the deep dive into their journals really gets fascinating for me, because they aren't just mapping rivers and mountains. They're stumbling into the deep past.
We are in August now. They are up near the La Plata Mountains, right around the modern Mesa Verde area. And Dominguez and Escalante write in the journal about finding strange ruins of stone cities perched on the canyon rims.
They found the ancestral Puebloan ruin?
They did. They had stumbled right into the remnants of the Anasazi culture, though we use the term ancestral Puebloan today.
Right.
But think about the psychological impact of that moment for these men. They are out there desperately looking for a route to the future, a way to save their empire by connecting to California. But the very first major thing they find is evidence of a massive, completely collapsed civilization.
That has to be haunting.
Very haunting. They recognized immediately that the people who built these stone cities were sophisticated. They were sedentary farmers, and they were long, long gone. It adds this heavy layer of deep time to their journey.
Like looking at ghosts?
Yes. They realized they weren't the first masters of this land. Empires had already risen and fallen right where they were walking.
And as they walk through this haunted landscape, they are naming everything they see. The Rio Chama, the Rio Navajo, the San Juan River, the Animas. I mean, these are the names permanently printed on the Colorado map today. They were literally writing the geography as they walked.
That is the ultimate power of the first survey. When you name a mountain or a river, you claim it for your king. But writing geography is relatively easy when you are walking down a nice, wide valley. It gets a lot harder when you hit the canyonlands.
And they hit a serious crisis point soon after, right along the Dolores River.
They did.
This is what Escalante called the Labyrinth of Miera in the journals, right?
Well, that is actually a slightly later historical term applied to it, but it fits perfectly. The terrain around the Dolores River is incredibly rugged. It is just endless canyons twisting back on themselves, sheer drop-offs, blind dead ends.
It is tough to navigate even now.
It's confusing even with a modern GPS satellite system. And Miera y Pacheco, the confident, expert military engineer, got them completely and utterly turned around.
This had to be a remarkably tense moment for the group. You have the so-called expert who is supposed to know how to navigate by the stars and the instruments, and he is leading you in circles in a canyon while your food supply slowly dwindles.
It was a massive leadership crisis.
Right.
Miera was arrogant, he was confident, but he was dead wrong. He was trying to apply standard European geographic logic to a landscape that completely defies it.
The Canyonlands don't care about European logic.
Not at all. And this is where the entire expedition pivots. The friars realize that to get out of this labyrinth alive, they can't rely on Miera's compasses or his old engineering degrees. They have to swallow their Spanish pride and rely entirely on local indigenous knowledge.
So they found a guide.
They managed to recruit a Ute man they encountered, whom they baptized and called Silvestri. And with him was a young boy, maybe 12 years old, whom they named Joaquin.
Joaquin.
Yes. And I really want to put a pin in Joaquin for a second. This kid is the unsung hero of the entire enterprise.
Yeah.
He isn't just a local guide. He effectively becomes their passport through the rest of the West.
A 12-year-old kid.
Yeah, he sticks with them through starvation, through freezing snow, through absolute misery. Without Joaquin bridging the cultural gap and showing them the trails, they'd likely just die of exposure in that labyrinth.
So with Joaquin and Sylvester taking the lead, they finally break out of the canyons and head north. They cross the border into modern-day Utah, near where Dinosaur National Monument is today. And here, in the journal, Escalante suddenly puts on his geologist hat.
His scientific observations here are just stunningly accurate. He describes the Mancos Shale perfectly.
What did he write?
He writes about passing through bluffs of loose dirt, some lead-colored and others of a yellow hue. If you drive into Dinosaur National Monument today and just look out your car window, that is exactly what you see.
That gray, crumbly rock.
It is this gray, crumbling, ugly, distinct rock. It shows that Escalante wasn't just nervously scanning the horizon for enemies. He was actively looking at the Earth itself. He was rigorously analyzing the soil and resources for the future expansion of the empire.
And they left a physical mark right around here too, didn't they? Tell us about the inscription on the tree.
Right. They camped near a grove of large cottonwoods. And one of the men in the party carved the words Año de 1776 into the trunk of a tree.
The lane inscription.
Yes. And it is a very traditionally Spanish thing to do. It is a semiotic act of possession.
Claiming the space.
By carving the date and the cross, you are claiming the space. You're saying the Spanish Empire was here, this belongs to the king. It transforms a wild, natural tree into a political monument.
Is the tree still there?
The tree is long gone, now of course lost to time and rot. But the written record of that carving in the journal is a formal claim to sovereignty.
But then, right after claiming the land, they make the big mistake. The monumental geographical error that messed up American maps for 50 years. They hit the Green River.
Ah, yes. The Rio de San Buenaventura.
Tell us about this.
They reached the Green River near present-day Jensen, Utah. Now, the Green River is a massive river. It is wide, it is powerful, it carries a lot of water. Miera stood on the bank, looked at the flow, looked at the general direction it was heading, and he made a colossal hypothesis.
A guess.
A very bad guess. He hypothesized that this river did not flow south to join the Colorado River, which it actually does, but that it flowed straight west.
He thought it went all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
He convinced himself, and he convinced the friars, that he had finally found the legendary River of the West. On his official map, he drew this massive river cutting straight across the Great Basin and dumping right into the ocean somewhere near San Francisco.
But that is a massive physical error. I mean, that river would have to flow up and over the Sierra Nevada mountains.
It is geographically impossible. Water doesn't flow over 10,000-foot granite peaks. But Miera wanted it to be true so badly. A navigable river flowing from the interior straight to the ocean would be the holy grail of imperial trade.
It would solve all their problems.
Exactly. And this error persisted on published maps for decades. People like the American explorer John C. Fremont were wandering around the deserts 50 years later, desperately looking for the San Buenaventura River, all because Miera drew it on a piece of paper in 1776.
It really shows how a map, even a completely wrong one, creates its own reality for people who follow it.
Maps are incredibly powerful tools of fiction sometimes.
So despite the wrong map, they keep moving. They cross the Wasatch Range, which is no small feat with a herd of cattle. They come down through what is now Spanish Fork Canyon, and they finally see it. Utah Valley.
The high point of the entire expedition. September 23rd, 1776. They climb a small prominence. It is actually right near where the Spanish Oaks Golf Course is today in modern Utah, and they look out over Utah Lake.
What a view that must have been.
To them, after weeks of dry canyons, crumbling gray shale, and endless sagebrush, this view was an absolute revelation.
Escalante actually calls it a terrestrial paradise in the journal.
He wasn't exaggerating his feelings. He describes abundant, clear water, the lake just teeming with fish, waterfowl everywhere you look, plentiful game in the surrounding hills, and rich, lush soil for farming. It was the complete antithesis of the arid lands they had just suffered through.
He saw a new home.
He immediately saw it as the perfect location for a massive future capital of the northern frontier.
And the people living there, the Timpanogos Utes, they were actually relatives of their guide, Silvestre.
Which changed the dynamic of the encounter completely. Because they walked in with Silvestre, this wasn't a tense, potentially hostile first contact scenario. It was basically a family reunion.
They were welcomed.
The Timpanogos welcomed them with open arms. The friars spent days preaching, of course, but it was also a highly successful diplomatic summit.
This really seems like the moment where the mission shifts. They aren't just passing through looking for California anymore. They're making long-term plans.
They absolutely were. In the warmth of that welcome, the friars made a very solemn, formal promise. They told the Timpanogos leaders that they would return within 1 year.
1 year.
They promised to bring more friars, to build a permanent mission, to bring herds of livestock, and to teach them Spanish agricultural techniques.
And this was a promise they fully intended to keep, right?
100%. At that specific moment, Dominguez and Escalante truly believed they had found the glorious future of the Spanish presence in North America. And while they were there, they gathered incredible ethnographic data.
The journals are full of it.
It is the first comprehensive written account of the Ute peoples in the Great Salt Lake Basin. Escalante meticulously noted their diet, their complex social structures, the fact that they lacked horses compared to the Plains tribes. It was an intellectual goldmine for the empire.
But, winter is coming. It is late September in the high country. They cannot stay in this paradise forever. They still have official orders to get to Monterey.
Right. And this is exactly where the tone of the journey drastically shifts. It goes from a story of discovery to a story of raw survival. They leave the Utah Valley Paradise and head south, roughly following the corridor of what is now Interstate 15.
And gets bad fast.
Almost immediately, the paradise fades in the rearview mirror. They hit the desert again.
They enter the Pavant Valley.
Yes. The water they find turns brackish and salty. The terrain gets desolate and hard on the animals. And the local indigenous people they meet in this area were very different from the Utes up north.
These were the Bearden Indians they described, right?
Yes, the Pavant Utes. Escalante was absolutely fascinated by them because these men had full, thick facial hair. He wrote that it made them look exactly like Capuchin Padres back in Europe.
Which was unusual.
It was a physical trait that was very unusual for most indigenous groups in that specific region. It sparked a lot of intense curiosity and wild speculation in the journals about where these people originally came from.
But as fascinating as that is, scientific curiosity does not fill your stomach, and things are starting to fall apart for the crew. Their secondary guide, Jose Maria, another local they had picked up along the way, he deserts them.
That was a very bad omen. Jose Maria witnessed a Spanish member of the party physically punishing one of the servants. It was a violent scuffle, and it absolutely terrified him.
He saw their true colors.
He likely thought, well, if they treat their own Spanish servants this way, what will they do to me when things get tough? So he vanished in the middle of the night.
Leaving them blind.
Exactly. So now they are heading into the unfamiliar, vast desert in late autumn with literally no guide who knows the way to California.
And then the weather turns on them.
Early October, a massive, freezing snowstorm hits while they are camped near modern-day Milford, Utah. They are physically stuck. Escalante writes that they were imprisoned by the snow.
Imprisoned?
Now, put yourself in their shoes for a minute. They're wearing thin, summer-weight Franciscan habits. Their food supply is rapidly dwindling. It is sub-freezing outside. And they are staring at Miera's map, realizing that the high passes of the Sierra Nevada, which they still have to cross to get to Monterey, are still hundreds of miles away.
Right. If they couldn't even handle a freak October snowstorm in Utah, the Sierra Nevadas would have eaten them alive.
It was a suicide mission to keep going west. That was the firm assessment of the colliers. They looked at the shivering men, they looked at the dying, starving horses, and they said, we have to turn back. We have to go back to Santa Fe right now.
But Miera disagreed.
Miera was incredibly stubborn. He was looking at the grand strategic goal. He argued fiercely that they should push west through the snow. He wanted to reach the coast to validate his maps and achieve the military glory of making the connection. He openly thought turning back was cowardly.
So you have a full-blown mutiny brewing, the military mindset clashing directly with the religious and pragmatic mindset.
It was a tense showdown, and it happened at a place now called Dominguez Knoll in Iron County, Utah. The tension was literally breaking the party apart. The crewmen were grumbling, taking sides, whispering about revolt. They had to make a final decision, but neither of the leaders would budge an inch.
So how do two 18th century Catholic friars resolve a strategic deadlock with a stubborn military engineer?
They cast lots.
They literally gambled on the fate of the expedition.
Well, they certainly wouldn't call it gambling. To them, gambling is relying on blind chance. This was divination.
Putting it in God's hands.
Exactly. They called it leaving the decision in God's hands. It is an ancient, deeply biblical tradition. If mortals cannot decide a vital matter, you let the Almighty cast the deciding vote. They wrote Monterey on one slip of paper, and they wrote Santa Fe on the other. They put them in a container, prayed over it, and drew one out.
October 11th, 1776. The day the fate of the entire expedition, and maybe the West, hung on a tiny scrap of paper.
And the lot fell to Santa Fe.
Miera must have been furious.
Oh, he was bitterly disappointed. The journal explicitly notes his intense dismay. But because the decision was made through a sacred religious ritual, he couldn't argue with it. He could argue with Dominguez, but he couldn't argue with God.
From a modern historical perspective, though, looking back, was this the right call?
Without a single doubt. It was an absolute masterstroke of leadership. If they had tried to cross the Great Basin and the Sierra Nevadas in November and December of 1776 with no guide and no food, they would have vanished.
They would have been a tragedy.
They would have become the Donner Party of the 18th century, just swallowed by the snow. By turning back, they preserved their own lives, But crucially for us, they preserved the journal and the maps. The scientific data survived only because they turned back.
But turning back didn't mean they had an easy ride home. They are now in absolute survival mode.
This is the segment of the journey I always call the ordeal. They are wandering blindly through the Arizona Strip in southern Utah. The terrain is brutal. It is nothing but deep canyons, sheer mesas, sharp volcanic rocks. And they run out of food entirely.
So they start eating the horses?
They had to. Escalante writes a very grim entry that the horses were the only provisions left to them.
That is awful.
Imagine the heavy psychological toll of that action. You're a Spanish caballero. In that culture, the horse is everything. It is your social status, your transport, your companion in battle. To butcher and eat your own horse is to admit you are no longer a conqueror. You were just a desperate refugee. It really shows how starving they were.
And just when they think it can't get worse, they hit a wall. A giant, freezing, water-filled wall. The Colorado River.
Right. They are trying to cross back to the south side of the river so they can reach the Hopi villages for help. But they are stuck in the Glen Canyon region.
Which is just cliffs.
The canyon walls are sheer rock, dropping hundreds of feet straight down to the water. And the river itself is deep and freezing cold. They spend 2 agonizing weeks just wandering along the rim, looking for any possible way down.
Didn't they try to cross at Lee's Ferry?
They tried. But the river is too fast there. The horses were far too weak and starved to swim against that kind of current. They almost drowned trying.
So they are trapped. Winter is closing in fast.
They are completely trapped until they finally find a spot. They were actually led there by some local Paiutes who took pity and pointed the way. They found a spot where the canyon walls sloped just enough to maybe, possibly, get down. This is the famous site known as the Crossing of the Fathers, or Vado de los Padres.
But this wasn't just a simple matter of walking down a steep hill and wading across. This was a desperate engineering project.
It was. The slope they found was solid sandstone, slick rock. Even if the men could somehow scramble down on their hands and knees, the hooves of the livestock could never grip that rock. They would just slide off the cliff.
So what did they do?
Starving, freezing, and utterly exhausted, these men took their metal axes and painstakingly carved steps directly into the stone. They manually built a staircase down the face of the canyon wall.
That is just an incredible mental image. These exhausted men hacking at the solid earth just to get their few remaining horses down to the water.
And it worked. On November 7th, 1776, they finally forded the river. That moment is really the dramatic climax of their survival story. And it is worth noting for listeners, if you try to visit this specific historic site today, you can't see it. It is entirely submerged under the waters of Lake Powell.
Wow.
Yeah, you can't see the steps anymore. But for a very long time, they were a visible, physical testament to pure human grit.
So they make it across the river. They are safe-ish. They head south toward the Hopi villages. Now, the Hopi and the Spanish have a very, very complicated history, don't they?
Complicated is putting it mildly. Back in 1680, during the massive Pueblo Revolt, the Hopi had violently ejected the Spanish priests from their lands.
They threw them out.
They destroyed the Catholic missions completely. And ever since that revolt, they had fiercely maintained their absolute independence. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with Spanish religion or Spanish government. So when Dominguez and Escalante, wearing their friar robes, stumble into the Hopi village of Arabi on November 16th, they aren't exactly greeted with a welcome parade.
The Hopi refused to let them into the village, right?
Correct. The Hopi men came out and physically blocked their entry. They vehemently refused to listen to any preaching. They rejected the spiritual mission entirely.
Which makes total sense given the history.
And here is the fascinating twist that really restores a bit of your faith in humanity. The Hopi leaders looked at these men and they saw that they were starving to death.
So what did they do?
They gave them food, they brought out maize, they brought water, and they gave them the supplies they needed to survive.
That is just fascinating to me. It is this attitude of, we completely reject your God, we reject your king, but we will not let you die on our doorstep.
It is pragmatic hospitality.
Oh.
And it absolutely saved their lives. It gave them the necessary calories to make the final grueling leg of the journey over to the Zuni Pueblo and then finally back to Santa Fe.
So January 2nd, 1777, they finally arrived back in Santa Fe.
And they look like walking skeletons. They have been gone for 159 days. They traveled over 1,700 miles. They walked a giant, jagged, agonizing circle through the uncharted wilderness.
And if you look at their original official mission statement, which was to find a route to Monterey, they failed.
They absolutely unequivocally failed. They never reached California. They never established that northern route. They promised the Utes in Utah Valley that they would return within a year to build a mission, and they never did.
Why not?
The Spanish bureaucracy back in Mexico City looked at the reports and simply refused to fund it. It was too far too expensive. Dominguez was actually reassigned to a mine post and essentially demoted for the failure of the expedition.
Right.
So in terms of their stated objectives, it was a total bust.
But we called this deep dive success through failure. So for the listener, where exactly is the success in all of this?
The success is entirely in the legacy they left behind. Let's look at the maps first. Bernardo Mieri y Pacheco sat down in Santa Fe, took all those messy notes, and drew the very first visual framework of the interior American West.
Even with the massive errors like the river to the ocean.
Even with the errors.
Yeah.
Yes, he created the dangerous myth of the River San Buenaventura. Yes, he drew the Laguna de los Timpanogos as this weird, completely inaccurate hourglass shape that somehow conflated Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake together.
Right.
But amidst those errors, he also correctly identified vital water sources. He identified timber stands. He identified potential mineral deposits. He definitively proved that the terrifying terrain could actually be traversed by Europeans.
He essentially gave the next generation of explorers a starting point.
Exactly. His maps provided the foundational intelligence for what would eventually become the Old Spanish Trail. Decades later, when commercial trade routes were finally established between New Mexico and California, the traders used the raw data that Dominguez and Escalante had suffered to collect. They didn't use the exact same path, but they used the hard-won knowledge.
And then there's the human element, too. The ethnography you mentioned earlier.
This is arguably the most valuable part of the journey for us today. Escalante's detailed journal is the very first written description of the Southern Paiute and the Ute bands in that specific region. He documented a complex world that was, frankly, about to change forever.
He captured a snapshot in time.
He described their peaceful interactions, their extensive trade networks, their unique social customs. It is an irreplaceable historical document.
And it is rare, too. That level of peaceful interaction is rare in exploration history. Usually, these stories of European explorers pushing into new territory end in gunfire and tragedy.
It is remarkably rare. And it happened primarily because the mission was fundamentally religious, not military. They didn't have a big army to throw their weight around. They were incredibly vulnerable. And because they were vulnerable, they had to be humble. They had to ask for help instead of demanding it. They had to rely on guides like young Joaquin.
Joaquin, the 12-year-old guide who saved them in the labyrinth. What actually happened to him?
He returned all the way to Santa Fe with them. He was officially baptized there. He really became a living, breathing link between these two completely disparate worlds. His presence in the story constantly reminds us that this wasn't just a handful of Spanish men wandering alone in an empty landscape. It was a deeply cross-cultural event from start to finish.
So, as we synthesize all of this for the deep dive, we really do have the other 1776. While Jefferson is in a hot room writing about theoretical liberty, Dominguez and Escalante are out freezing in the mud, mapping the physical geography of the continent.
Exactly. While a brand new nation was being born in the East, completely unaware of the West, these two friars were out there defining the physical contours of that West. They bridged the massive gap between the ancient, abandoned ruins of the deep past and the modern imperial administration of the future. They brought the terrifying unknown into the light of the map.
And they did it by failing.
They did. If they had somehow miraculously succeeded, if they'd stubbornly pushed through the snow to California, they almost certainly would have died in the mountains.
And the journals would be gone.
Or, even if they survived, they might have established a Spanish supply route that would have completely changed the dynamics of the war with Mexico 50 years later. But by making the hard choice to turn back, they left us a pristine record of the land exactly as it was, complex and wild.
It really makes you think about the nature of success. Sometimes the forced detour is actually the destination.
And sometimes, making the humiliating decision to just go home is the bravest, most valuable decision you can possibly make.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to mull over. A provocative what if based on these sources.
Let's go back to that freezing day at Dominguez Knoll, October 11th, 1776. The casting of lots.
What if the slip of paper they pulled from the hat had said Monterey instead of Santa Fe?
If that lot falls the other way, Vieira gets his wish. The military hawk wins. They push west into the frozen Great Basin Desert in late October. Without food, without proper clothing, they likely freeze or starve to death long before ever reaching the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The journal is lost to the snow. The map is never drawn.
And the entire interior West remains a complete, terrifying blank spot on European maps for another 50 years.
Maybe even longer. Maybe the later American explorers, Lewis and Clark, Zebulon Pike, Stephen Long, maybe they encounter a completely different geopolitical landscape because the Spanish never formally claimed that territory with their named rivers and their carved trees. The entire future history of the American West literally hinged on a tiny slip of paper drawn from a hat on a windy, freezing hill in Utah.
That is just a staggering thought.
Yeah.
History is so incredibly fragile.
It is. And that is exactly why we dig deep into these stories.
That is it for this deep dive into the Dominguez-Escalante Expedition, the other 1776. We really hope you look at the map of the West a little differently the next time you are out there. Thanks for joining us.
Keep exploring.